Well, thanks everyone for coming and for being here. And we're going to keep this very informal to encourage discussion and learning from each other. This is a hybrid meeting, so we're all here in person. There is a virtual group joining us somewhere out there in cyberspace. One of our panelists is with us. The other three, we have two of them we know for sure, and we're waiting for the third, but we're going to go ahead and start anyway. The panelists are going to introduce themselves, and that may be news to them, so I hope they're prepared to talk about themselves a little bit in terms of their experience and why they think we invited them to be a part of this panel today. The other thing I will say is we want the kind of talking heads portion of this to be relatively brief. So I'm going to take about 5 minutes to just provide you with some context in terms of what the objective of this session is, why it's a part of the retreat agenda, why those of us at the Resource Center and in leadership and on the operating committees think it's an important topic. Then each of the panelists are going to have about 5 minutes to give you an overview of their thoughts about clinical planning, funding for clinical trials, whichever of their area of expertise. And then the majority of the time, which will be the hour, so we only have an hour and a half, the majority of the time will be the panelists discussing and or reacting to each other. But most importantly, questions from you, discussion points, things you may have run into in the translational process that you think someone on this panel might be able to shed some light on for you. So does that all make sense? Work for everyone? As if you had a choice at this point, right? Sort of how it's going to go. Okay, so if I haven't met you and some of the California teams especially, I have not had a chance to do that. My name is Francine Berkey, and I'm with the Avenues Company, and we are a part of the Michigan Pittsburgh Wyss Resource Center. And our role with the Resource Center is to help with market assessment, understanding clinical dynamics and clinical development. And we have helped most of the team in our part of the consortium with making connections to clinicians who are future customers to learn more about a lot of things, including their indications, who their customer will be, right? Because in the doc space, that can be complicated. It might be a dentist, it might be a physician, it might be a neurosurgeon who is both an MD and a DDS, or like our friend Tara Agalu, a triple doc, right? So you just never quite know who the customer will be until you dig deeper into that. And also just understanding, of course, what we believe is the ultimate goal of any translational technology process, and that is clinical adoption. So I think because of the parameters of the grant, it is sometimes the case that the ITP teams, and maybe even some of us involved in other ways in the grant, get our eye on the prize of the FDA and what the FDA will either require or allow us to do from a clinical point of view. And then that's kind of the ultimate goal. Well, it's really not the ultimate goal of the translation process. The goal of the translation process, of course, is broad clinical adoption of the technology so that it benefits patients. Because unless it gets adopted clinically, that isn't going to happen, and that's what we want to see happen. So we have had some teams in this consortium who have been told by experts, oh, don't think about the clinical plan. Don't think about it. It's too early. You're too early. Don't do that. Well, that, in my opinion, is a real disservice to those teams because it's never too early to be thinking about clinical adoption. And to get clinical adoption, of course, you need the right clinical data. And the right clinical data to lead to adoption gets defined by whom? The customer, the clinician. You have to know what will convince them. What convinces the FDA, and I know some of our teams I work with are sick of hearing me say this, so sorry to be a broken record, but what you need for FDA clearance or approval is necessary for sure for commercialization and clinical adoption, but it isn't always sufficient. And so it's really important to think about the clinical plan and to learn from the right people what the clinical outcomes should be, what the protocol should look like. And in order to do that, you need funding because clinical trials are typically expensive. So the whole purpose of this session was to say, how might we, the consortium, the resource center, the leadership teams, how might we help the ITP teams get a better understanding of what is needed for clinical development, for clinical trials, and how do you pay for those? What are the ways in which you might pay for them? So we have assembled a group of experts for our panel that we think will be able to help cover topics, including developing a clinical trial plan that will lead to adoption, how to plan for the logistics of a clinical trial, how you might fund clinical trials, and what goes into developing them. The idea is that you might take all this knowledge back with you, and regardless of where you are in the left to right stepwise process, you could start integrating what you learn today and what you learn about the needs for your clinical trial into what you're doing now, which may still be in vitro work or it may be animal work. But the more you can integrate what you have learned about what will eventually be needed into what you're doing now, we're hopeful that that's going to prove to be beneficial for you. And I guess we'll find out. And I hope you'll let us know if it was helpful or if this is the sort of thing you'd like in future retreats to have more information about. So I only have one of the panelists with me, and he's not going first. I think we have Rick Hurd going first. Hi, Dr. Hurd. How are you?
Good, Francine. How are you?
Good.
So
I'm going to let you introduce yourself, Rick, to the group. And there's a virtual group too, right? Right, Elise? There are people who could be chiming in. So you have people in the room, and then you have the virtual folks. So if you would like to introduce yourself and then give us your overview, we would appreciate it.
Yeah, as Francine was saying, I'm Rick Hurd. I'm a full-time private practicing periodontist, but I am also the executive director of the McGuire Institute. And this slide, I think, nicely captures one aspect of our discussion, which is our mission statement on how we design clinical trials that will be driven towards adoption. And so my goal is to provide insight from a private practitioner's point of view as the executive director of a private practice-based research network and how we interpret clinical trial design. Therefore, I want to briefly cover the development of clinical trials and how their findings help adoption of the everyday delivery of care. So I think that it's important for us to have some perspective on dentistry's basis for clinical decision-making on therapeutic options. In 2008, a study found as little as only 7 to 8% of dental treatment was considered to be evidence-based. And the American Dental Association recognized this gap in clinical practice, which led to the founding of their Evidence-Based Dentistry Center with the guiding principle that evidence-based dentistry is an approach to the oral healthcare decision-making process that requires integration of clinically relevant scientific evidence related to the patient's medical and oral health in combination with the dentist's clinical expertise, patient needs, and preferences. The ultimate goal of this principle being to promote, teach, and practice evidence-based dentistry. This is becoming more and more mainstream and is evidenced by the articles being published, for instance, in the Journal of the American Dental Association, at the education level, in our dental schools, and in general dentistry lectures overall. As a result, the promotion of evidence-based dentistry will create a continual need for clinically relevant evidence. So periodontics, my specialty, has led the way in evidence-based delivery of care. Best evidence consensus statements are a model of scientific inquiry to address questions of clinical importance. The American Academy of Periodontology's most recent BEC, conducted in April, was on the use of biologics in interbony defects of treatment for contemporary periodontal practice. The focused clinical questions that are developed assess the body of evidence on therapeutic outcomes which demonstrate consistent, clinically meaningful benefits. BECs serve to guide practitioners on therapeutic decisions in order to deliver the most predictable outcomes for their patients. While BECs are not the only source of guidance used by practitioners, they represent a careful assessment of all treatment options whose clinical trials were appropriately designed, which allows for these comparisons. The BEC's goals are to summarize any demonstrable clinical benefits given by the therapy employed by defining evidence-based conclusions, comparing and contrasting these results with expert opinions that are comprised of private practitioners, providing clinical practice recommendations, and providing conclusions based on expert opinions. They further define future research recommendations based on limitations of the current body of evidence. BECs are based on systematic reviews and meta-analysis, and the figure on the right represents a network meta-analysis on treatment modalities using biologics in bone loss defects around teeth. As you can see, it's quite complicated. The key takeaway point on BECs or any systematic reviews or meta-analysis is that these analyses are only possible if a clinical trial was appropriately designed with clearly defined methodologies, result reporting, and analysis. Therefore, the most important step in designing a clinical trial is to follow a pathway that accounts for the clinically relevant questions in addition to the points we just discussed. This illustration captures a typical clinical research pathway, starting with protocol development and IRB submission and approval. And then you initiate the study. You have coordination and monitoring and closeout. You verify the data, and then the biostatistical results analysis can facilitate comprehensive reporting for internal review and regulatory submission. Importantly, following that, we develop a manuscript for submission to publication, along with delivery and communication of these key findings by the investigators. Obviously, the development of the protocol is crucial in setting up the pathway for success. If a clinical trial is conducted in an environment that most closely reflects the conditions and subject populations in which a product or innovation will be widely employed throughout the dental profession, these findings can be more readily disseminated by bridging and shortening the translational gap. Therefore, the study's conclusions are more easily adopted into the everyday delivery of care and can mainstream these methods as a standard of care. So in summary, this graphic illustrates the key components to successful clinical adoption. And we believe you need to have real-world evidence, clinically meaningful outcomes, long-term data which validates the importance of the discovery, and communication of findings through key influencers such as the investigators of the studies, which serve as powerful multipliers in influencing clinical adoption. So I hope this sets the table for the discussion on the factors that should be considered when designing clinical trials, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hurd, very much. So the second panelist, right, is in person. So you're on, Dominic.
So thank you very much, Francine, also for the for the invitation by the committee. My name is Dominik Lüssek. Perhaps I'll give you a brief review over my CV. I'm actually a chemist by training. I did my PhD in structural biology, and then through a couple of strange events, I ended up doing clinical research in dentistry. I started up with at the firma Geistlich, which some of you might know. Then moved into clinical trials in a pharma startup. And then in 2010, I founded my own company, Credentis, and I ran that for 10 years until 2020, also being in charge of the whole clinical trials program that we ran there. Today, I have a couple of hats, or a few hats that I'm wearing here. I'm still the technology scout for Vivardis, which is the company that acquired Credentis a couple of years ago. I'm a partner at a venture capital company called Revere Partners. We specialize in financing of oral care and dental companies only, mostly early stage. So a lot of the projects that I've heard this morning very much are in line with what our vision is at Revere. And third, and perhaps not quite as relevant here, I'm also the CEO of a company called PharmaTrail. We develop clinical trial software for clinical trials in order to secure the valuable clinical data on a blockchain. That is really very much for giving transparency to the regulators, meaning if your clinical data is going to get reviewed by the FDA or any other regulator, you need to make sure that it's not only the outcomes, but also that the data is raised according to GCP. And unlike real life, you have to prove that you actually did that. And generally, the suspicion is that you did not do it correctly. So I guess my role here in the podium is very much the investor view. I can tell you that clinical trials and clinical trial programs are an absolute essential part of any business plan or any business case that we look at. If you haven't included that, we would not say that your plan is mature enough for us to be able to finance that. As Francis said before, clinical trials cost money. Unfortunately, they also cost a lot of time, and they always tend to take a lot longer than you than what you plan initially for. Also, I think one key takeaway that I would like to give is if you have to do clinical trials for your regulatory approval, then it might not be the same clinical trial that you will run for your marketing efforts. So very often clinical trials run for the regulator are focusing on safety criteria, whereas when you're trying to promote your products, you really look very much into efficacy or effectiveness, whatever your product might be. So if you can combine those two, that helps. But if that ends up in you having to run longer studies, as Rick has shown before, then it might actually be a better use of your money to run two trials, one focusing on the safety and the other one focusing on the efficacy that will run later on. But I think that will probably be part of the discussion, and also that is an individual decision by you when you develop your business plan. But the only thing that I can or that I want to put as a takeaway is that if you don't have that clinical data, you will not sell any products, because the user wants to have the security that this has really been tested. And preclinical trials, in vitro data, etc., they're nice to underline your message, but they don't carry your message. Secondly, really budgeting of the trial. I think I've seen one adaptation today in one of the presentations where they budgeted about 1.2 million for a trial. For a decent sized trial in a medical device, I think that is a reasonable amount of money that you would need to work with. As Rick said before, I mean, a real trial that is done according to GCP needs monitoring. Monitoring alone costs a 6-digit number for any trial. There are helpful ways today. I mean, you can engage software to do off-site monitoring, to facilitate recruitment, etc. But in the end, that might just shift some of your costs to software. But you know, those patients, they don't get monitored for free. So perhaps one last thing, when we as investors look at companies that have done trials, you know, if you're lucky and you have a 510K, you could get your regulatory approval early. You do your, you know, many of you are within university settings where you have access to clinical sites fairly easily. You might have done some trials. So for our due diligence as investors, we would, first of all, we would look very closely at the full report of that trial. So that was point 3 in Rick's list. I don't care much about the publication. I know we need that later on, but I want more detail. I want a lot more detail than what is in a publication. Secondly, we will start talking to stakeholders, meaning investigators, other clinicians, competitors of yours. What do they think? Is that sufficient data to convince the user to really start using that product or not? So we will spend a significant amount of time of our due diligence to look into that clinical data, because it is of such essence to the success of the project. And with that, Francine, I would like to hand it back to you. Next.
Thank you very much, Dominic. So is Orlando there and ready to go? Great.
Yes, hi.
So we may be able to hear him, but not see him. Okay. Orlando, are you there?
Yes, hi. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
We can. We just can't see you. But
yeah, I apologize. Something's going on with my laptop camera, so I apologize for that.
That's okay. We'll just, if you could begin by introducing yourself and talking a little bit about your role on the panel, we would appreciate that.
Sure, absolutely. First off, thanks so much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be with you and to be part of the panel here. So I am Orlando Lopez. I am the director for the Dental Materials Biomaterials program at NIDCR, as well as the Institute's coordinator for our small business program. I primarily oversee a basic science and translational research portfolio dedicated to biomaterial development, intended for the restoration and repair of dental craniofacial tissues, as well as other technology areas encompassing a number of digital technologies around biosensors, oral biodevices, and digital technologies that really support the overall spectrum of digital dentistry. Prior to my role here at NIDCR, I served at FDA. I was a medical device regulatory reviewer, where I spent a number of years leading a number of technologies to market and approvals, particularly in the space of cardiovascular technologies, but focusing primarily on the diagnostic aspect of the developments, as well as a number of different areas there. And so I wear a couple of hats. In the Institute, I collaborate with a number of different trans NIH initiatives, and I also oversee a program that we support at NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, to support the development of clinically relevant standards, particularly around the space of restorative dentistry, dental materials, And most recently, we expanded that project to also look at biocompatibility, trying to get earlier assessment and developing of frameworks and tools that can provide earlier indications of the biocompatibility of new materials, which is important, especially in the context of the regulatory paradigm where biocompatibility is typically looked at the very final stages of a product, of a medical device. And so we found through a number of discussions and assessments, we have determined that in the space of dental biomaterials, particularly, a lot of the biocompatibility is not done early on. So there's a lot of work, a lot of effort that is put into developing new materials with a lot of great capabilities, but the biocompatibility aspect is sort of considered at the very end. And so it doesn't suit us very well to have you know, a material that is stronger and that can do many things, but is not biocompatible. And so we're looking to change that paradigm, as well as the technologies around oral biosensing, especially the ones that go into the intraoral cavity, and trying to optimize the best ways to functionalize those sensors. So those are some of the example activities that I've been involved with. But in the context of this particular panel, there is, of course, a number of considerations, and particularly in the concept of getting things to market from a regulatory standpoint. Just wanted to share kind of like four C's that folks in the regulatory space typically consider. So the first C is the clinical need, and product development should definitely be driven by clinical need. A lot of times we see a lot of development done just based on the technology and not necessarily looking at how is based on the clinical gap or the clinical need. And so that ultimately will become the indication. And so it's really important to have a really good and critical understanding of what that clinical need is, and what might be necessary to actually develop a product, and getting the adequate requirements and criteria that are needed for the development, not just from the biologic perspective, but also of course, from the engineering and the overall product development. I think I really appreciated a comment that was given earlier about that it's never too early to think about clinical adoption, and that's very true. Also, it's also never too early to think about potential manufacturability, and that's maybe kind of ties into the characterization piece. So the other C is the characterization, and so really thinking about what are the best methods and approaches to characterize these materials or these products at the early stages of preclinical development to really get a full, good picture, solid picture, robust picture, particularly around the safety piece. And I think the previous panelists mentioned about the two different areas of clinical trials, you know, focusing on safety and some on effectiveness. In my experience working with early stage development and, you know, especially academic investigators, they tend to go right away for the effectiveness piece right from the get-go, and that's important. But thinking about regulatory aspects, it's important to balance the two, to balance the safety and the effectiveness, and of course we want innovation, and we want to push the limits on new technologies. But innovation also creates questions, and when new innovation, you know, cutting edge technologies come to FDA, if there is no historical precedent for that technology, then of course there's going to be a lot of questions. And so setting the stage for safety, you know, through either literature, you know, baseline, or early stage preclinical development, that's very important. The other C is thinking about case by case. So every product, it's somewhat, you know, should stand on its own and demonstrate the clinical need, but also the capabilities and the characteristics around safety, effectiveness, and overall performance. And so from a regulatory perspective, you know, each technology is taken on its own. And the other C is communication. And so really having a robust approach to communicating with all the stakeholders in a meaningful way, in a way that that everybody can understand, the different aspects of the technology, and integrating a team and the expertise in a way that can really substantiate the end goal, and to identify what that supporting evidence is going to be needed for a particular claim. So it's important to also consider that every claim that is made on a product needs to be supported by data. And so it's great to have a lot of possibilities of in a product and potential applications, but each application should sort of be packaged in a standalone manner. So I think that those are a couple of key considerations there. And in terms of the other aspect of engaging with the regulatory perspective in order to move to the next stage, which is to enter the human testing, of course that communication is very critical in a way to build awareness and to educate the regulators, particularly around what are some of the critical aspects of those products. How is the innovator, the development team, addressing and mitigating some of those risks, which can be mitigated either through the design aspect or testing, or a number of different communication aspects in terms of the labeling, the instructions for use, and the way that the product is going to be manufactured. And so for clinical trials in this space, I think it's important to also consider the infrastructure that is going to be supporting the clinical trial in the context of, are you going to have enough material to actually run a trial? Is that material going to be robust enough? Is the quality of that product, adequate, and it's going to be, accomplished, in GLP type of, scenarios, and that all has to be, vetted by FDA. So thinking about all those elements early on is very important. So I leave it there, but definitely look forward to the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Orlando. So our last panelist, we can't find her. She's lost in cyberspace. Okay, all right. Well, I guess we'll just maybe she got times confused or days. That's one of time zones probably got her confused. So okay, and if she does join, you can let me know, and then we will let her chime in when she arrives. So let's start by seeing who here in our in-person audience might have questions, and then Elise is going to track the questions that come in online, and I will ask them of the panelists. Let me just ask that when you ask the question that you let Katie get to you with the microphone so everyone can hear it. And if it's for one of the three panelists, if you could just identify who you're directing at. If it's for anyone, then you can just let us know that, and we'll try to keep the discussion on track that way. So hands if there's a question. Over here.
You might want us to introduce ourselves. So Kevin Healy, UC Berkeley. This is a generic question to thank you first to all the panelists. Is very enlightening, I would say. Just so everybody recalls, this program only takes us up to clinical trial, right? We're all clear. So the question is, it's almost like the second valley of death. Like, how do we go from our preclinical studies to the clinical trials? I guess that's my first question. Second question is, we're always advised to prepare our preclinical trial to sort of model what we would see in a clinical trial. And it almost begs the question, we need to be talking to all the clinical trial experts as we're developing our large animal models. And so I'll take any advice there, please.
Okay, Rick or Dominic or Orlando, would one or the other of you like to answer that question?
Well, I'm happy to go first for anybody to chip in. So you're absolutely right. I mean, a preclinical model should represent the clinical reality as much as possible. But I would even go a step further back. When you actually run or when you actually develop your project plan, I would already at that point start talking with clinicians, which I've heard today that most of you have done, because that is your first step into some kind of clinical protocol and ultimately clinical adoption. So I think you cannot keep that in mind early enough, because you're right. Otherwise, it's a value of death. You might have developed a great clinical, preclinical model. You've done the experiment, things turn out well. And then you find out at a later stage that something was wrong in your model. Worst case scenario is you need to go back. So in the end, we do all these projects in order to have patient benefit ultimately. So I think you should keep that in mind as early as possible. And that will also ensure you that your clinical model, your in vitro models, etc., are actually adequate to what you're trying to do.
I had a sort of a question like that. I thought Rick might want to address it, which is, how do you decide who to get that clinical input from in order to understand the clinical need and what the clinical protocol would need to be like for it to be adopted and brought to patients? Do you want to talk a little about that, Rick?
Yeah, can you hear me okay? So from our perspective, we've had conversations with people at the preclinical stages at all aspects. I mean, they may be in animal studies and trying to ascertain, is that applicable to the human clinical trials? But in reality, once you get involved with the clinicians, defining what is the current therapeutic modality questions we have that remain, or how would that wrap into our current therapeutic modalities is an important aspect. And so, we've been at the very developmental stage where we were asked that very question: is this something of need? Is this something that you may see of benefit? Should we carry forward? And what do you need to know? And so, that requires a careful review, like I was showing the BECs or systematic or meta-analyses. And those can help paint the picture of what the current body of evidence is and where our questions remain, or what would be the applicable gold standard to which you're going to compare to. And you may not be able to do that in your preclinical steps or through the regulatory phases, as they were alluding to earlier. But we've had some studies that in the context of the safety in the pivotal trials, we're able to address some level of efficacy or applicability from a clinical perspective. And that's a nice home run if you can do that. But again, it requires a knowledge of the landscape of the field where you think this is going to be applied, and also talking to other fields, that you may get it from a periodontist perspective. For instance, we had a local drug delivery system that consisted of minocycline, and it was treating localized breakdown of bone or disease around the teeth. And they actually found that, I'm sorry, I'm talking about Rustin is the actual name, but they actually found dermatological benefits. And that is where it blew up from there, where the majority of their business is currently. And so you never know what may come out of other fields or specialties through these initial clinical trials, or you may not even be aware of what you don't know from a perspective of what are the tie-ins to other fields besides the one you think is applicable as well.
Okay. Orlando, did you have any comment on that, or shall we open it up?
Yeah, no, sure. So thank you. That's a good question. Well, so I think thinking of translating, getting into clinical trials piece and kind of considering the regulatory perspective. So while regulations can be somewhat rigid, the way their intent is satisfied can be flexible as well. And so it depends upon a variety of factors, and in some cases, the nature of the products shifts so much that the historical approach to satisfying these regulations can shift too. And so I know there's a number of emerging or newer guidance documents from FDA that have been released around, a number of the different like health, human cell tissue type products. And so while, of course, they're in some way not prescriptive enough, I think they can provide a theme about what is important. And so I think they all point to the characterization piece. And so to be able to really get started into the clinical trial aspect, trying to align as much of the preclinical work with this addressing the safety aspect is very, very critical. In some cases, there might be multiple species that might be needed. There might be a number of different animal studies that might be needed. In some cases, you might need to start with a smaller species model and then move up from there. So it really depends on what the clinical intent is of that particular product. So while, yes, it might be good to try to mimic the animal model, the animal study in the context of what the potential clinical study might look like. At the same time, it's important to try to really understand what the outcomes of those studies are going to be able to support. And so whether it's pharmacological toxicology, for instance, there is let's see, a number of other aspects, in terms of the characterization. And there is a number of course, a lot of innovative ideas for complex products, but a lot of times they have very unstable manufacturing methods. And so the lack of adequate characterization of these therapeutic products, I think creates a lot of uncertainty for the regulatory aspect. And so if some of that like technology development piece can be sorted before, really trying to think of a clinical trial or in tandem in a way, but I think they're not independent of each other. And so trying to really think about how the product development, how the different, characterization elements are going to be supporting the different questions on risk. So really doing a very thorough risk analysis from the get-go. And I would suggest, having a living like target product profile that, kind of keeps building and evolving with the actual development. I think it's important because in that way, then you can tie in all the different aspects of development and the clinical components that might potentially, be important. And of course, always having that clinical oversight and perspective from the clinicians, because a lot of times the animal study can raise some flags or come up with something, but maybe the scientists doing the work may not have the clinical perspective that might actually be needed to highlight something that may potentially be able to translate to the clinic from the perspective of safety. So I think that's an important piece that I think a lot of times gets missed.
Orlando, maybe you could comment on what I think was part of the original question from Dr. Healy as well, which is about funding clinical work, right? So
absolutely.
With a grant like this, we say it ends before you go into clinicals. And his point was, then what? We have a second valley of death, right? We made it through the first one, and now you're telling us. Can you, from the NIDCR perspective, talk about funding options?
Sure, absolutely. Well, so I think in general, of course, we know NIH and IDCR funds projects across the entire spectrum, from very basic science through product development and clinical trials. And so, we're definitely happy to work with, the different teams, development teams, to guide them and provide particular funding opportunities that might be most aligned. NIDCR particularly supports clinical trial type of products or projects through the UH3 mechanism, which is analogous to a phase 1, phase 2 SBIR, STTR. So there's a phase 1, that's the UG part, and then the UH part, that's phase 2. And so the phase 1 of that is basically a planning phase. And so, the applicants, awardees will get funded to actually develop the plan, to run the clinical trial, and then the phase 2 will be the implementation piece. I think that's a really very powerful approach or mechanism as well, because you get a lot of support, to really help, develop that robust plan. So that's one aspect that I think is very important, and of course we have a whole clinical branch that can provide more insight as to the different resources that researchers might be able to tap into in order to build a network that is needed, perhaps to get access to certain data, maybe real world data, real world evidence, which that's another element that I think is also very important, in the supporting of these emerging technologies, and to maybe mitigate some of the testing perhaps that could be well suited for supporting certain claims. And then, of course, we have a number of other mechanisms, just the traditional mechanisms. But happy to chat with any of the researchers that are interested in this space and moving their products to the next phase. Through NIH, we also have the seed office, the small business office at NIH, which has significant resources as well. They provide a number of different resources to awarded researchers, which may include experts from like entrepreneur in residence, folks that these are folks that have decades of experience in many cases, working in industry and bringing products to market, and they have of course significant network. They can definitely help to cater and to provide refinement on the product development piece, and of course be able to enhance the capabilities of their ability to move the products forward. And I think we have some folks from our seed office here. Chris.
Hey,
Chris.
Orlando.
Yeah, so please go ahead. You can chime in. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. So hi, my name's Chris Sassiella. Sorry I couldn't be there in person with you guys. I did ask, but strangely, my boss said no. So I do wish I could be there meeting and talking with you all, trying to understand more about the products you're working on and some of the specific needs and gaps that you see in the support that exists right now and how my team could help with that. I am the Innovator Support Team Lead in the Small Business Education and Entrepreneurial Development Office. And as Orlando already described, we have a rather large set of commercialization expertise, subject matter experts available to help folks just like you, NIH awardees, working in the product development space. So there are about 20 folks on my team, spanning entrepreneurs in residence, regulatory subject matter experts, and reimbursement subject matter experts. It's really easy for you to get access to us. All you have to do is send me an email and say, hey, I am an investigator and I have this award. This is my program officer. I have some questions that are kind of business related as opposed to science related. And let me know what those questions are. We'll put together the right team to help you guys connect and get some really good one-on-one consultative advice. Now, we're not going to put together your IRB package or your FDA package for you. That cannot be our job for any number of legal and practical reasons. But what we can do is bring literally decades per person of experience to a conversation with you so that you can learn from some of the lessons that we've learned as we've gone through this. Myself, I have been in the product development space since 2002, ranging from discovery through holding files to working with innovators such as yourself for the past decade. My EIRs have each led companies. They've led startups. They have failed as well as succeeded in their exits. They've worked at Fortune 100 or Fortune 200 companies by and large. The regulatory and reimbursement SMEs have extensive backgrounds at FDA and CMS, as well as in the private sector and in the clinical sector. So we'd love to be able to talk with you and help you understand a little bit more about how to approach all of these challenging questions as you're looking to get your projects and your technologies advanced into human trials and adoption. In addition, we are currently working on setting up a website that's going to have a whole bunch of resources that can help you understand the regulatory and reimbursement paths and activities that you might need to engage in. I am working on developing the content. I've got another team working on developing the website. So hopefully we'll have that soon. I see a couple of hands raised in the room. So either it's time for me to stop talking or it might be time for me to respond to a question.
Yeah, this is Francine Berkey. I'm the moderator. So yeah, we you kind of came in on the tail end of a question. But now we're going to go back to I think a couple people here had questions.
Just if we could ask, I'm sorry, we didn't get your name, and if you can give us the email in the chat so that
absolutely. So my name is Chris.
Okay, thank you.
Sasiela, and it's first.last@nih.gov, but I will drop it into the chat.
And it would be great if we could get the slide decks, if the speakers are willing to put those up somewhere in this
we hadn't
meeting.
sort of expected slides, but there are some, and it would be great to get those. So we'll find out about that for you, Dr. Neal. Yeah,
and just to a quick addition to Chris's comments. I also wanted to mention that there is a lot of network with investor events that Chris, maybe you can talk a little bit more about that and how the seed office, can provide a lot of network opportunities for investor events, and depending on the level of development. But that's also an available resource.
Okay, thanks.
Absolutely.
No, we're gonna go back to the clinical trial planning discussion. We've had a couple people in the room who've had their hands up for a while. So
okay, great.
Nancy,
yeah, I want to make a really quick comment.
Go ahead.
And that I was able to get a California Institute Regenerative Medicine $20 million grant to develop a compound all the way through clinical trials. And so it was a trial by fire, and we got everything done. But I learned a lot of things, and it's just, it's a little hard, but it's also very easy. And that you came up with an idea in your target product profile that you gave to us at CDoctor that we kind of approved. And most of you have devices. And most of the time you have, well, I want to take about Tara's project. You've got a clinical outcome and a radiographic outcome, right? And so those two are going to be your either co-primaries or your secondary outcomes. And you're going to do, you're doing your proof of concept, getting that done in the animals. You're going to do the toxicology you have to do, and then you're going to plan your clinical trial. And the first one's going to be safety, with a little bit as safety number 1, 2, 3, and 4, but you're also going to throw in, if you possibly can, some of those efficacy endpoints, because there's almost no real true phase 1 anymore, because your investors want to know if there's any chance that you're going to be successful. Now, the other thing I want to mention to you all, you probably already know this, but at least 20 times a week, I get emails from these services that have these investors that want to talk to experts in the field. And they are the people that work in these investment firms that you're trying to get money from often. And they want to know from people like me how to design the clinical trial. So they are sitting there trying to get as much information as they can to tell you what to do from the experts, because they become experts by listening. They tape record the conversations. But the point is, they're already going through in their minds how many people you're going to need, what the outcomes are going to be for your early studies. So kind of remember that the people that you're talking to try to get money for these studies have already reached out to experts in the field.
I think Dominic was calling that due diligence, right?
Well, I'm not sure it's exactly due diligence. I think it's called gaining the information, kind of gaming the system. But anyway, the point is you've really, you got to work with, hopefully you're working with your clinicians if you're not one already, and you're just building up toward what the FDA and the clinicians that might adopt these new therapies or these new devices are going to need. That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, there's one more question here in the room, or a couple maybe, and then do we have virtual? Okay, good.
I actually also have a comment. I'm Erica de Boever. I've done 20 years of clinical development, small and large molecules, gene therapies. I agree with everything that's been said here. One thing from my experience I would caution against is, because of limited funds, I would say really plan your studies very early, as has been said here, but really think through the design. And I've seen some programs where people really try to front load it with all sorts of exploratory outcomes that then need to be, as you said, Dominic, monitored. The data need to be cleaned, and then it sits in a database and never gets looked at. So, and it costs money, and it really drives up the cost of your studies and can impact the quality of your output. So I would say focus on what you really need and do that well.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that comment. I think something that was important said with you, Nancy, and also here, we've seen two types of projects here. We've seen the more medicinal type projects that will need to go through the phases. And we're talking about ultimately two pivotal trials costing you, I don't know, between 50 and 100 million. And then we have the projects that are medical devices. And I don't want to call it shortcuts, but there is still a lot easier route to market for medical devices than there is for medicinal products. Simply because your effects are local. I mean, you don't have to look at the whole systemic effect that your product might have, or at least with less focus, therefore. So in my very first comment, I said something about, whether you can combine safety and efficacy. That is really only possible with medical devices. I don't think you can run a phase 1 trial and really do a great efficacy outcome. You might do it, as was hinted at before, as a secondary, try to get a feeling for it, what is actually going to be your benefit, but this is more exploratory than anything else. So we are looking at two very, very different classes. And by the way, you're also looking at two different types of investors. Because if you're going into medicinal, you will need to look for the really big VCs, because you will need to raise, 25, 50 million, do an IPO or something like that. If you don't exit earlier on, that's, that might be an option as well.
And what Dominic just mentioned about investors is also true to some degree, right? Depending on whether your potential future customer is a dentist in private practice or a oral surgeon who practices at hospitals, right? In terms of reimbursement, in terms of who you talk to. So knowing who you should get feedback from based on who will use your product and where could be really important too. Steve, I think you had a question.
Hi, everyone. Very nice panel discussion. Appreciate it. And I have a question for you, Dominic, and maybe others can come in too. But as entrepreneur and scientist, we are very accustomed to sort of learn by, baptism by fire. And looking back, we can always do things better a second time through. And now you've been through a big clinical study, developing and taking a product to market and exiting. So in terms of planning and then fundraising and then execution of that clinical study or trial, looking back in hindsight, what would you do differently? What are some of the nice lessons you learned?
Okay, for that, I probably have to give a very quick overview on how we tackled this, which Steve, you might know. So with Credentis, we actually did a first-in-man trial with the University of Leeds, which was uncontrolled. By the way, we developed a remin agent, a biomimetic remin agent based on a self-assembling peptide, which is regulated as a medical device in Europe. In the US, it's actually an OTC drug because we added fluoride to it, and the self-assembling peptide becomes an excipient, which really it is. It's a facilitator. So we started off with a first-in-man trial, uncontrolled. We did the same then in a proximal study where we did X-rays, where we, for example, found out that recording standardized X-rays is practically impossible. So we actually tried out a primary outcome, which we realized wasn't a good one, not one to really get dependable data in a clinical trial, much more in a practice-based setting, which we've done later on. Then we ran 5 smallish, between 30 and 90 patients randomized controlled trials, both as adjunct, meaning together with fluoride varnish, and some without, always versus the gold standard, which is fluoride varnish in that respect. So we kind of took one step after another. I wish we would have taken a little bit more of a leap of faith earlier on, but it would have been a higher risk because our whole clinical trial program took us about, I would say, until everything was published, it was probably 8 years. Until the trials were done, it was at least 6. So, that's significant time to really market. I mean, we had CE label, which, the European market approval, fairly early on, but, we tried to sell like as you would try, but we utterly failed because we didn't have the clinical data to actually move the market. So today, I think I would not market, and I wouldn't even try before I have the full set of clinical data. Even if that would mean telling my investors that, yes, I theoretically could sell, but I'm actually not going to. Which was my original plan, and then the board kind of pushed us to more and more, try to sell anyway. So generally, I think focus. I would, whatever trial program you come up with, whether it's 2, 3 trials, whether it's 1, impact trial, really try to put the focus of the company on it. Because if you don't do that, it will be slow. And don't try to be cheap. Because investigators' sites, they cost money because they invest their time and they invest their effort. And yes, they should be motivated as well, but they also have costs. And you as a company need to cover those because otherwise your recruitment times will be too short. So again, put that into your budget and into your pitch when you try to raise your money. Nancy.
You have no idea what these trials cost. Whatever you think they cost, just increase by 40% and hope you're right. And academics, we're terrible because we always trying to do things for less. That's what the institutions teach us. But when it comes to these trials, I'm exactly right. And if you have a good clinical trials consultant or contract research organization that I hope you'll all be working with at some point. They really know, listen to them, and it's going to hurt. I mean, you can buy houses for what these trials cost, but unfortunately the FDA has set a very high bar and you have to do a lot to get there. Take two.
They're not all the same. So do your research to make sure that the one you work with has the expertise and the capabilities to support the work you need to do and has the people with the right experience. They'll also come with their A team to the pitch, and they'll give you their D team if you let them. So just beware.
Yeah, well, we had two CRO representatives on the panel, but at this point we just have one because we did not get him.
But I want to stay with that for a minute because, you know, lessons learned. Ask around, talk to people, really talk to people. They know, and they'll give you, ask for their references and then dig a little deeper. A lot of it has to do with just the kind of people that you are comfortable working with, because you're the one, or your clinical manager is the one that needs to really be in touch with these people. And also be aware of turnover. There's a lot of turnover, and the people you start 2 years later might not be the ones that you end with. I hate to tell you this. And so, you know, you're going to be frustrated no matter what, but just just really do the best job you can to find these CROs.
And Rick, as the representative of a private practice-based CRO, maybe you want to comment on what Nancy just said, or this idea of CROs and how you choose them and what to look for.
Yeah, we really had trouble. We were a private practice-based research network, primarily just the investigators. And our issues were finding a dental specific CRO, or one that understood what we were trying to accomplish. And most of them were oncology based, pharmacology based, and dentistry didn't translate as easily. It was always very expensive and not necessarily an understanding of the terminology or the field. And it was more of an experience for them to learn and maybe add that to their resume. And so what we have evolved into is trying to run the CRO capabilities for our own network, and hiring those personnel from CROs that have those industry specific needs, as well as being able to relate that to any potential sponsors that come our way, and develop a really good network of subcontractors to help point them in the right directions where our capabilities may be limited. And, you know, our capabilities pertain to surgical therapy in dentistry. And we know that field very well. We have a cadre of underlying subcontractors that have expertise in regulation, medical monitoring, you know, all of those aspects. But from our perspective, we know how to run a study really well within our own network. And that's what we advertise as with respect to a CRO itself. We can develop the protocol. Everybody in here is asking what a study costs. And I will tell you the first thing that I will ask you is, do you have a protocol? And the reason being is you're asking a site to run a study based on a synopsis. That's where the numbers or the moving target occurs, because once you flesh out the protocol and you understand the intricacies of what is going to occur at each visit, each step, the monitoring, all of those capabilities or necessary activities really impact your bottom line. And so you want to know a per subject cost. You want to know an overall study cost, the CRO side, the site side. And all of those factors can be better defined and more clearly understood if you have a protocol you believe in and has been vetted. And that's where you want to start.
So thank you very much for both those comments on the CROs, and I can only second that. Unfortunately, there aren't really a lot of dental CROs because until very recently, because it's 99 or 95% medical device, it's very specific. So I think you will never get away from hiring a good trial manager within the company that then should manage the CRO. Don't forget, the CRO is going to pitch to you the Rolls-Royce. That's what they want to offer you. They want to do everything. But then you have a service catalog and you need to decide what do you want to do yourself, meaning in-house, and what are you giving out of house. Secondly, modern technology is helping to a certain extent. So if you can do anything decentralized or offsite monitoring with good software, don't underestimate that. You will need software today anyway. When you run trials, those times are over because you cannot get the quality of the data anymore if you run a paper-based trial. So you might as well look into clinical trial software that facilitates offsite monitoring, for example, that allows running decentralized trials where the patient doesn't come into the office every time, because that all will lower costs. Just think of it. The monitor doesn't have to travel throughout the US to do 80% of the monitoring. That alone is going to cut down travel costs enormously. So those things, keep those in mind, but I can only second what Rick just said. Unless you have a developed protocol, any kind of, pricing budgets will be guesstimates at most. And CROs, I'll come to you in a second. CROs, they live of all the trials running longer than you are.
I'm sorry to make you walk so far, but if you're planning a clinical trial for an over-the-counter product, as opposed to one that's delivered by a healthcare professional, are there things that we should do differently or think about or make the planning different?
So perhaps I start with that. Thanks, Brian, for that question. So first of all, if it's a medicinal product, no, because the regulatory hurdle is still going to be the same and it's going to make life really, really difficult. If you are in a OTC drug part, then yes, because actually your trials are not used for regulatory approval because you will write under a monograph, and your trials will be for marketing mainly. So because even if you sell to the consumer, you will still need endorsement by the professional. I've also learned that the hard way. So your trials will be probably trying to involve some of the key opinion leaders in order then to spread the word. But regulatory-wise, you're a lot better off if you're under monograph. If you're if you're a device and you're trying to sell it to the public, you will still be under the same scrutiny from a clinical trial perspective. So if it's a de novo pathway, the FDA will still scrutinize your data. I don't know how much, and to be honest, Orlando, I'd really love to hear your experience there, where, how deep the scrutiny on de novo clinical trial data goes. If you have a 510K, very often the clinical trial data is supportive and it's not essential. So again, there, You're a little bit easier off, but today it does not. You might run smaller trials and you might run a few more of those for marketing purposes, but I think you should still keep the GCP standard because that'll come back to haunt you if you don't.
So I just learned that Kim Martin has joined us. So Kim, if you're there, we don't have a lot of time left, but if you prepared something for your overview that you'd like to take 5 minutes or so to share with us, that would be appreciated.
I did not prepare anything. I'm so sorry.
Oh,
I had this on my calendar for tomorrow instead of today.
Okay. All right. That's fine. Well, if you'd like to chime in at any point, please feel free to do that.
Absolutely.
Are there other questions? Yeah, Katie, Andrew has one.
So we heard a lot about the huge pitfalls and risks and things not to do when designing or finding funding for clinical studies. Is there a recent product launch, maybe even in dentistry, that you felt did a really great job at, getting a clinical study done for clinical adoption or getting a faster path through the FDA, or even maybe both together?
So generally in the medicinal space, to be honest, there is so much credibility if you run 2 pivotal trials that, that's what the blockbuster business model from pharma works on. And theoretically, that would work the same way in dentistry, because I think the credibility of those big pharma trials is very high in general. When it comes to the medical device space, if you look at what I think all of them, because there are so many launches there, it's the clinical trials are prerequisite, but there is something called post-marketing clinical follow-up, which, so unfortunately it's not over once you have your regulatory approval. You're actually now obliged to do clinical trials on an ongoing basis. Those are generally, so post-marketing clinical follow-up, they will be more marketing centered, and thank God your budget will be a lot lower because you're actually not too worried if one of them doesn't finish. But to come back to your question, I don't really remember any of the products that, or really good products that have come on the market where I think they've done a good amount or an exceptional amount of work. I think one of the key factors is if you have to do a number of trials, try to spread them out. Do not do them in one center. Try to engage various stakeholders, because there is also, unfortunately, if you run a trial, not everybody will just believe what you've just published or what you've just done. It will be under scrutiny, and the more different groups you involve, the better it is. So unfortunately, I can't come up with an example at the moment, but perhaps one of my colleagues can. I don't know.
So this is Orlando. Yeah, I don't, nothing off the top of my head kind of pops up in terms of like a particular product type, but what I would maybe point to, is definitely engaging with FDA early and often. And when working with the CRO, like some of the comments that were made earlier, I think it's definitely critical to be able to have the protocol in place in a way that is sort of gets the green light from FDA. So in the early stages, being able to interact with FDA at a level where you get that feedback on the different protocols, the different ways that developers looking to characterize the product. What is the product? What are the potential safety risks? And then what are the different maybe models, animal models, and that's at the preclinical stage. Then once the preclinical stage is substantiated and then safety can be demonstrated at a level that is sufficient for an IND, then coming in with those clinical protocols to be able to say, okay, these are the endpoints, and these are maybe some surrogate points that we're looking to characterize. And just the entire aspect of the randomization, power analysis, very robust power analysis to be able to really be able to substantiate the safety piece, but then the effectiveness long term. So I think that's a way that working with the CROs could be mitigated. Not to just leave it to the CRO alone, but to be able to have that sort of backbone that eventually FDA is going to have the final word on whatever is done. So it doesn't matter what the CRO does, or it doesn't matter what the researchers do on their own. If it gets to FDA as it's not in par with their expectations, then it's not going to go very far. And so that's maybe some comments there. And then in terms of the OTC comment or question earlier, I don't know too many OTC products in regenerative medicine space. So I think I would be curious to maybe get some examples, but in general, the OTC designation in a way could be even harder than a prescribed product, because then the risk is higher if that product is not used properly. So I think the trials in that respect might call for some significant usability studies to be able to validate the way that the product is used, the operator, having very robust instructions for use. So the labeling has to be very clear, and not just for the clinician, but maybe if it's going to be over the counter, then maybe the patient and other users. So really kind of having a better handle on the usability, I think is critical for the OTC designation. And that's something that, of course, FDA will have, I think, a great way to, a lot of things to say about that. And it's on a case-by-case basis. So if there's a product that would be a prescribed product, and then maybe later on, there's a possibility to include the labeling of OTC, I think that it could be a maybe more robust approach, just like if you have a 510K, or if the product already is in the market and you can identify a predicate, then you can leverage that. So in that way, then you can sort of leverage the historical precedent of the product from a regulatory perspective, and then that can streamline the path to market. So that's another sort of item to think about, the regulatory strategy. So it's not, so boiling the ocean from the beginning, it's maybe not the best strategy, but trying to understand what is that clinical need, and then trying to piecewise potential indications that might get you there eventually, but what are the sort of small wins that you can build on from a regulatory standpoint? What can we get to market? What can we get to market first with a lesser indication, and then maybe build from that? So that could be a more meaningful platform that, in the long term could be a lot stronger, and maybe help streamline future products that might actually get to that same goal.
Thank you. Are there other questions? We have like a few minutes left, so we.
So Stephen reminded me that I also was supposed to talk about funding. So, rule number one: if money's on the table, you take it. Now, I'm honest. So yeah, you might think, oh, I can get a better valuation, or valuation is not what I was hoping for. It's never going to get any better. Because if your back is against the wall, the valuation will go down. So as I said, if it's on the table, you take it. Try to think through the whole process. So for example, you asked me what I would do different before. When I started Credentis, I thought we would develop a single product. At one point, we realized that we were actually sitting on a technology platform where a whole bunch of products were coming out. That's, if I have to raise money for a single product, that's a completely different thing, well, in the medical device space, than trying to raise money for a platform technology. Because there I would have probably gone to VCs a lot earlier and not have stayed with the angels, because the angels, they have kind of a limit at one point. I mean, we raised 12 million from angels, and I don't think there are a lot of companies out there that raised more money from just angels. You need to do the switch to VCs or private equity at one point, but the angels are not going to like that. So, you know, if you think big, if you think this is not, you know, this is a product that you really want to, you know, pull through to market success, not sell early, etc., then think about who you want to approach for the funding. In the end, you might not have a choice, but at least try. And sorry if I go back to an earlier point, Nancy just reminded me or asked me to say that when it comes to CROs for phase 1-2 trials, so now we're back in the medicinal space, there are a number of clinical trial units in universities that you might want to have a look at, especially if you have collaborative universities that have phase 1 trial units. That might just be a good way, or a little bit of a cheaper way, or a better way to get grants to get at least through your phase 1, because your phase 1, you know, you can say you have a first in man, but it's not the one that's really going to generate an enormous amount of value yet, because it's mainly a safety trial. Sorry if that bracket, but thank you very much, Nancy, for bringing that up to the group.
These clinical trial units within the universities and the medical centers have evolved because of the wonderful work you're all doing, and how sometimes the universities have ways to get a little money to give you, to get you going, can underwrite it a little bit because it fits their strategic plan. And it can be more work, but you know, it may be a stopgap that you can get going while you look for other money. And last thing that Dominic said, if it's money and if it's green, it may not be all you want, but take it. And I was working with a group who actually had an investor, and then they're about to get the money, but the person that was running the company was getting kind of demoted, as can happen when you get money. People think they know a little more than you sometimes, but they're giving you the money, and then he didn't take it. And it's been 2 years. The idea's gone. So yeah, when you get money.
Okay, well, we're at the 5 o'clock mark, so I think we will wrap it up. Thank you all again for coming. Thank you, everybody, virtually, and we hope it was helpful. And I don't know, is there housekeeping, Elise, that we need to do as we leave? Thank you, panelists. Thank you, everyone online. Take care.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. That was wonderful. You know, later tonight for the in-person people, we've got a reception at 5:30. It's just one floor up.